exactly killed the Western? And what parallels does the death of the Western have with the decline in popularity of the comic book movie today? Let me start by saying the Western never really died. In fact, there's been a Western made pretty much every year since the advent of cinema. That being said, there was a point in time when the Western was the world's most popular film genre. And much like the comic book movies now, there was a very noticeable decline. Both genres experienced explosive popularity driven by cultural relevance and a strong connection with audiences. The Westerns had their iconic stars and franchises, just like comic book movies boast their larger-than-life heroes and interconnected cinematic universes. The cultural significance and audience appeal of both genres highlight their roles as a reflection of contemporary society and its values. Fair warning, in order to really connect these two genres, I have to mainly focus on the rise and fall of the Western. I'll sprinkle in bits and pieces about comic book movies and their parallels to the Western, but I'm really going to connect it at the end. But before I get into that, if you like this video or like any of the content on this channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Also, consider becoming a member of my Patreon to help me continue making videos. Hit the link in the description for more. Now, the Western genre, with its rugged landscape, stoic heroes, and timeless tales of good versus evil, has been a cornerstone of American cinema. From its humble beginnings to its golden age and eventual decline, the Western has left an indelible mark on the film industry and continues to influence filmmakers and audiences alike. It was both the comic book movie of its day and where bold and innovative filmmakers made their names. But its decades-long romance at the top of the American film industry had to come down at some point, and of course it did. Oddly enough, the roots of the Western are very similar to the origins of the comic book movie. The roots of the Western genre can be traced back to the early 20th century. One of the earliest narrative films, The Great Train Robbery in 1903, directed by Edwin S. Porter, is considered a seminal work in the Western genre. It used innovative techniques for the time, such as cross-cutting and on-location shooting, which set the standard for future films. In particular, the cross-cutting established a new cinematic language for audiences to understand, opening doors to numerous film innovations in the years and decades to come. To be clear, the film didn't invent cross-cutting, but its use of it was very groundbreaking. This film established the Western as a popular genre in early cinema, capturing the imagination of audiences with its tale of a daring train heist. But what it didn't do is make the Western a genre that was taken seriously by critics and audiences. Westerns were popcorn movies. On the other hand, comic book movies have been going on since the 1930s, with films like The Mandrake and the Magician, The Shadow, The Adventures of Captain Marvel, Batman, The Phantom, Captain America, Superman, Flash Gordon, and Godzilla. And just like the early Western, the comic book movie was considered a B-movie, lowbrow entertainment. Now, the Western saw that change around the middle of the century, right when comic books started to flourish for the first time. The Western reached its peak of popularity from the 1930s to the 1960s, known as the Golden Age of Westerns, which is also typically regarded as the Golden Age of Hollywood. Cultural and societal factors such as a fascination with the American frontier, as well as the cowboy archetype, fueled its popularity. Major studios produced a plethora of Westerns, with directors like John Ford and Howard Hawks leading the charge. The traditional Western gave rise to legendary stars like John Wayne and Clint Eastwood. These actors embodied rugged individualism and stoic bravery that defined the genre. John Wayne in particular became synonymous with the Western genre, starring in classics like The Searchers in 1956 and True Grit in 1969. Clint Eastwood's roles in Sergio Leone's spaghetti westerns and later films like Unforgiven showcased his versatility and cemented himself as a Western icon. But if there were two directors who had the biggest hand in shaping the American Western as the most popular genre, it would have to be Howard Hawks and John Ford. Howard Hawks and John Ford each left the Western in a more popular state than they found it. Hawks' focus on character-driven stories and genre blending brought a unique flair to his Westerns, influencing future filmmakers and creating multi-dimensional characters and narratives. On the other hand, Ford's mastery of visual storytelling and exploration of deep, often troubling themes helped elevate the Western to a respected and influential genre. Together, their contributions continue to shape the legacy and evolution of the Western and cinema as a whole. Hawks often blended elements of other genres such as comedy and drama into his westerns, creating a more well-rounded and relatable narrative. This approach expanded the appeal of the western to broader audiences. Think of it like how Marvel often blends action and comedy, two genres that can stand alone but also can elevate each other to a higher status.
Different Peter. Weird.
Thanks. Sorry.
His film Red River in 1948 is a landmark western that showcases his ability to blend action, character development, and psychological depth. Rio Bravo in 1959 is a quintessential Hawks western, known for its strong ensemble cast, including John Wayne, Dean Martin, and Ricky Nelson. The film focuses on themes of friendship, duty, and courage, with a balance of action and character-driven storytelling. John Ford, on the other hand, was a visual master. Ford's use of the American landscape, particularly Monument Valley, became iconic. His visual style emphasized the grandeur and harshness of the frontier, influencing the visual language of westerns in cinema as a whole. Ford's westerns often delved into social and psychological themes such as racism, revenge, and redemption. His ability to weave these themes into compelling narratives set a high standard for storytelling in the genre. His film Stagecoach in 1939 might be one of the most iconic westerns of all time. It's often credited with elevating the western from B-movie status to a respected cinematic form. It also marked Ford's first collaboration with John Wayne, who played the Ringo Kid, the role that catapulted him into stardom. The Searchers in 1956 is considered Ford's masterpiece and a seminal work in the western genre. The film stars John Wayne as Ethan Edwards, a complex and morally ambiguous character on a quest to find his kidnapped niece. The film's exploration of themes such as racism, obsession, and redemption, along with its stunning cinematography, left a profound impact on cinema. The Searchers had a huge influence on filmmakers like Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, and George Lucas. Really, John Ford and Howard Hawks' impact on cinema as a whole, but specifically the Western genre, can't be understated. But these weren't the only filmmakers making beautiful and amazing Westerns at the time. You had films like High Noon, The Naked Spur, Shane, My Darling Clementine, and The Left-Handed Gun. All of these films inadvertently influenced the next wave of westerns, which was a strong departure of what came before it. Okay, going back to the comic book movie for a second. In order to see the comic book movies change from B-movie status to a serious form of mainstream entertainment, you have to move forward a few decades. 1978 saw the release of Superman, which was a huge milestone in the comic book genre. The film made over $300 million worldwide and really set the tone for comic book movies being the financial juggernaut that they are. Although Richard Donner did do a great job with Superman, it wasn't until Tim Burton's Batman in 1989 where comic book movies became director-driven. Similar to both Ford and Hawks with the Western, Tim Burton brought his own sensibilities to the comic book movies, making it feel like a unique piece of work from a director. Burton's gothic style and dark imagery took elements from the comic book and made it feel cartoonish yet somehow real. It was the first time that we had seen a comic book movie through the unique eye of a director. Tim Burton doesn't get enough credit for really elevating the comic book movie to an artistic status. Yes, it was a film mainly made for entertainment purposes, but also had such a unique perspective, and that was solely driven by Tim Burton. His style and sensibilities were so unique that it can't be seen as anything but a Tim Burton movie. He brought artistry and a personal touch to the comic book genre. And from there, the genre began to elevate just like the Western genre before it. From the golden age of Hollywood, the Western saw many changes, and one of its most significant is the spaghetti Western. The spaghetti Western is the nickname for Westerns made in Italy. These Italian Westerns were not attempting to put Italian culture in the Western genre, but rather use Italian artistry to shape the style of the American Western. After World War II, the Italian film industry was looking for new genres to explore. The Western, with its universal themes and iconic imagery, provided a fertile ground. Italian filmmakers were influenced by the American Westerns of the 1950s. However, they infused their own sensibilities, leading to a grittier and more stylized approach. Director Sergio Leone played a pivotal role in popularizing the spaghetti Western. His films, characterized by their unique visual style, moral ambiguity, and operatic storytelling, set the standard for the subgenre. Leone's influence on the Western genre is profound. He introduced the concept of the anti-hero to Westerns, most notably in Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name. These characters were removed from the clear-cut heroes of early westerns. They were morally ambiguous, driven by personal codes rather than societal norms. The shift towards complex character portrayals allowed for deeper, more engaging narratives that resonated with audiences. Leone's influence on visual storytelling with his iconic close-ups and sweeping landscapes created a new aesthetic for the genre that's been emulated by countless filmmakers. Leone's impact extends beyond the Western genre. The spaghetti Westerns also gave Westerns a more international appeal, demonstrating that Westerns could also be successful worldwide. Leone's iconic films like A Fistful of Dollars, For a Few Dollars More, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and Once Upon a Time in the West are all cultural touchstones for the Western genre. Beyond that, you have directors like Sergio Corbucci, who directed Django in 1966. Django introduced a darker, more violent tone to the spaghetti Western. All of these things changed Westerns forever. Around the same time, we were also getting the Revisionist Westerns. Westerns that were not concerned with historical accuracy, but more concerned with modern sensibilities. You had films like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, directed by George Roy Hill, which combined humor, adventure, and tragedy in a revisionist take on the early Western. The chemistry between Paul Newman and Robert Redford, along with the film's modern sensibilities, appealed to contemporary audiences. It changed the traditional Western's tropes and became more of a cultural phenomenon. Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch in 1969 is known for its graphic violence and bleak portrayal of the West. It marked a turning point for the genre, reflecting the turbulent social changes of the 1960s. With the comic book genre, you wouldn't see changes like this until the early 2000s. Comic book movies in the 90s started to be not so great. Particularly the later Batman films left a sour taste in audiences' mouths. It was time for a change in the comic book movies, and 3 movies in particular were the catalyst for that change: Spider-Man, X-Men, and Batman Begins. These 3 films are solely responsible for the explosion and popularity and the mainstream dominance that we've seen for the last 20 years. Each of these films had young, exciting directors attached to them, coming off of legendary independent runs and trying to make big waves in the industry. In the 10-year period between 1998 and 2008, you saw a huge upswing in comic book movies that were both mainstream and adult focused. And this is really when you started to see the split between styles of comic book movies. You had the films that were comic book movies and unashamed to be comic book movies, like X-Men, Spider-Man, and Iron Man. And then you had films that were more focused for adults, like Blade, Dredd, and V for Vendetta. But who I would consider the Sergio Leone of comic book movies, and who really started making people pay attention to comic book movies in a serious way, is Christopher Nolan. The Dark Knight coming out was a revolution for comic book movies. It was adult, but didn't isolate kids. It was fun, but wasn't silly. It was a well-rounded, well-made film before it was a comic book movie. That, along with Marvel's Iron Man, is responsible for the explosion that we experienced in the 2010s. And I don't really have to go too deep with the MCU, right? Because, most of us lived through it. We know what happened. It dominated and saw the comic book movies reach heights that weren't even seen by the Western. Not that the Western was dead by any means. You had films like Unforgiven in 1992, No Country for Old Men in 2007, and Hell or High Water in 2016. Basically, the Western had hung around for the entirety of cinema's life, but it doesn't mean that it was popular anymore. Despite its long-lasting impact, the Western genre saw a decline in popularity towards the late 20th century. Shifts in audience preferences, the rise of new genres, and the changing cultural landscapes contributed to its decline. Films like Unforgiven marked a dark, contemplative turn for the genre, deconstructing its myths and reflecting on its legacies. The Western's influence, however, remains evident for modern filmmakers, with its themes and aesthetics permeating various genres. So that brings me back to the original question: what exactly killed the Western? And how does it have parallels with the decline in popularity of the comic book movie today? Following the golden age from the 1930s to the 1960s, the Western began experiencing a noticeable decline. Audiences had been inundated with Western films for decades, leading to a sense of fatigue. By the 1960s and early 1970s, the repetitive themes and predictable narratives of many traditional Westerns were no longer captivating for moviegoers, who were increasingly looking for fresh and innovative content. This oversaturation of westerns contributed significantly to the genre's dwindling popularity. That being said, things like spaghetti westerns that were coming out in the 1970s, as well as more modern westerns like McCabe and Mrs. Miller, took modern sensibilities and applied it to the genre, keeping it alive through the decade. The cultural landscape of America underwent significant changes in the 1960s and 1970s. The Civil Rights Movement, Vietnam War, and the rise of counterculture profoundly influenced societal attitudes. The idealized portrayal of the American frontier and its simplistic morality in traditional westerns seemed increasingly out of touch with the complex and often troubling realities of contemporary life. Audiences began favoring films that reflected the nuanced and multifaceted nature of modern society, leading to a shift away from the straightforward narratives of the Western genre. But audiences still love escapist films, and even though they grew tired of it in the Western, they accepted it in new genres. As the Western's popularity began to wane, other genres started to fill it in. You had films like Steven Spielberg's Jaws in 1975 and George Lucas's Star Wars in 1977 that became the very first two real blockbusters. These films, with their groundbreaking special effects and epic storytelling, captivated audiences and drew them even further away from the Western. Additionally, the increase in popularity of science fiction, horror, and crime dramas during this period further contributed to the Western's decline, as these genres offered fresh and exciting narratives that resonated more with contemporary audiences. Box office numbers reflect the Western genre's decline in popularity. For instance, John Wayne's True Grit in 1969 was technically a box office success, grossing over $31 million, but subsequent westerns struggled to achieve a similar financial success. By the 1970s, you had films like Heaven's Gate that came out in 1980 that emphasized the genre's commercial struggles. Heaven's Gate was a notorious box office flop, grossing $3.5 million against a $44 million budget. The financial failures underscored the genre's inability to attract audiences, signaling the shift in public interest. Television also played a part in the decline of the Western. During the 1950s and 60s, Western-themed TV shows like Gunsmoke, Bonanza, The Lone Ranger, and The Rifleman were immensely popular, bringing the genre to the living rooms of millions of Americans. However, as the genre's popularity waned on the big screen, so did its appeal on the television. By the 1970s, many of these long-running Western TV shows were canceled, reflecting the broader cultural shift away from the genre. As American society evolved, so did its perspective on history, including the portrayal of the Old West. The romanticized and often sanitized version of the frontier depicted by many Westerns was increasingly scrutinized and criticized. Films and literature began to offer a critical, realistic portrayal of the Old West, addressing issues such as the treatment of Native Americans and the brutal realities of frontier life and the moral ambiguities of historical figures. This shift in historical perspective made the traditional Western appear outdated and less appealing than modern Western. The emergence of the Revisionist Western in the 1960s and 70s, which offered more critical and nuanced looks at the American West, also contributed to its decline. While films like The Wild Bunch and Unforgiven received critical acclaim and brought fresh perspectives to the genre, they also highlighted the limitations and outdated conventions of the traditional Western. The success of the Revisionist Westerns underscored the genre's need to evolve, but also pointed to the diminishing appeal of its classical form. So basically, audiences got sick of seeing the same old Westerns, and they didn't really like the inaccurate portrayal of the Old West. They also were given more options for new genres of film to latch onto. On top of that, American sensibilities changed, and it didn't really reflect the Western anymore. Things weren't so cut and dry, which made the traditional Western feel outdated. Now, if you were paying attention to what I was saying and know what's going on with comic book movies today, you can see the connection between the two, and how the current decline in popularity of the comic book movie kind of mirrors that of the Western. Oversaturation is a big part of why we saw declines in both popularity. In the case of the Western, the genre dominated not only the big screen, but television throughout the 1950s and 60s. Similarly, the comic book movie genre has seen an overwhelming number of releases, especially since the establishment of the MCU and the attempts by other studios to replicate its success. The oversaturation extends to television and numerous superhero series across various streaming platforms. The sheer volume of content has made it difficult for even avid fans to keep up, leading to diminishing returns and audience fatigue. A decline in perceived quality of both the Western and the comic book movies has also played a significant role in their waning popularity. As the Western became oversaturated, studios began producing lower quality films to capitalize, leading to a glut of formulaic and uninspired movies. This decrease in quality disillusioned audiences and critics alike. Similarly, the comic book genre has faced criticism for prioritizing quantity over quality. While early MCU films such as Iron Man and the Avengers were praised for their innovation in storytelling, recent entries have been criticized for their formulaic plots, which audiences are perceiving as a decline in quality. You get tired of seeing the same thing over and over. It's not new anymore, which makes it seem like it's not good. Even if you released this film 20 years ago, it would have been seen as completely different. Audience fatigue is a natural consequence of oversaturation and declining quality. Comic book movies are now experiencing a similar phenomenon to the Western, with new genres popping up and people having more options to watch. After a decade of superhero films dominating the box office, audiences are starting to show fatigue, and the evolution of competing genres are drawing audiences to them instead of the comic book films. You have films like Dune Part 2 and Barbie that are becoming more culturally relevant to audiences today, just like Jaws and Star Wars did before. But just like the Western genre, I don't think the comic book movie is going anywhere. It's going to continue forever. But it's going to have to reinvent itself several times and deconstruct itself and make something more compelling to audiences, which you actually have seen more recently. Films like Logan and Joker have pushed the boundaries of the genre, exploring darker themes and more sophisticated narratives. To put it simply, the thing that killed the Western genre, and that's killing the comic book movie, is corporate greed. Because something was so successful, corporations have the desire to recreate it, and they run things into the ground, milking every little bit out of it, which then turns off the audiences that love these genres in the first place. The Western has a long legacy in cinema, and I don't think the comic book movie is going anywhere either. What I would love to see is for both of these types of films to thrive throughout the next 100 years of cinema, because there are so many different types of movies that we all can love and explore. But let's not fatigue the audiences and let the quality drop just to make a little bit of money, because that's not good for anybody. People will stop watching, and the people that do watch will stop enjoying. Then you make no money, and the people have no fun at the movies.